You're listening to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust's podcast from the Hideout Bird Hide at Brandon Marsh Nature Reserve. I'm your host, Bob Hockenhull. Now, for some time, the UK has been described as one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Environmental groups, including the Wildlife Trusts, have warned that 1 in 6 species in our country are at risk of extinction. So, given that scenario, what are our hopes for the future of wildlife and the environment in 50 years' time? Well, both across the country and more locally in Warwickshire, it is a big concern. So joining me is Ian Jelley, the Director of Landscape Recovery at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, and Karl Curtis, who is the Director of Nature Reserves. So Karl, first of all, I like to be positive. I mean, are there any positive outlooks that you can give us, or is it all doom and gloom for nature in the next 50 years?
Absolutely, there's got to be positives, because if there's doom and gloom for nature, then it's doom and gloom for us. We rely on nature as much as nature the other way around. So we have to be positive. There's lots of things that we can do to make sure that we're bringing wildlife back, and really it's got to be an absolute priority of society now, is to help put nature into recovery and really reverse those declines of wildlife.
So Ian, if I can ask you, what sort of things are Warwickshire Wildlife Trust doing to try and buck the trend and get nature back?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is, Bob, that we're the first generation that knows that we're destroying the planet and the last that can do anything about it. And the best time to act on all this sort of stuff was 40 years ago, when we started to understand the decline of nature and the impact of the climate emergency. And we're now getting a momentum shift in society, led by a grassroots movement, really. And the Wildlife Trust is playing its part in helping bring communities together to take local action in response to the biggest threat to humanity. So we're able to work with businesses, work with individuals at a local level, with schools, with farmers, to help them consider how they can take different approaches to the way in which we all live our lives. Because fundamentally, people have created this issue that we're all facing now because of how society has developed. But we can change the way that we behave, and we all can play a part in that. So Warwickshire Wildlife Trust is working at a local level to understand how the environment can work for different people in different settings, whether that be golf courses incorporating nature into how they manage their golf course, or farmers, how they grow food without having an impact on nature, or how everybody can take individual actions at a local level. And we're starting to see real progress in nature's recovery, and ultimately making us more resilient to climate change here in Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you more about the actual physical projects that you're doing, but Karl, let's get the negative stuff out of the way. I mean, having worked for the Wildlife Trust for a long time, what sort of things are you noticing that are bad? What sort of declines in species and habitat?
Yeah, so I've worked for the Wildlife Trust for 12 years in Warwickshire. Prior to that, I did nearly a decade of working in sort of country parks. So I've spent the last 20 plus years out in the environment, and I've seen big change. And not to make a humorous point, but I can remember driving around when I was younger with my family, and my dad used to say, "Oh, this all used to be fields when I was a lad." And quite frankly, in that 20 years, I've now started to repeat that mantra. And obviously, alongside that, we've seen a decline in wildlife, and that might be particular songbird species, that might be different invertebrates, and everything that we've done has had a particular impact. Now, there are some good news stories out there about conservation, and we'll get onto those, I'm sure. But we need to recognise that actually there's this constant shift in baseline of nature being depleted in the UK. And again, we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And to try and put some context on this is that if you look at the Football League of 94 clubs that are out there, and portion that to countries, we're looking at dropping out the Football League. We're not just relegation fodder, we're out of existence fodder. And so that's a really bad thing for the UK, but perhaps just something that people don't recognise.
That was a really good analogy. I mean, you did mention about fields disappearing. I mean, how do you feel about the fact that, there does still be that constant pressure to build houses and for further development? Some people like to think that we can do it without harming the environment, but can we?
Obviously, any development or any particular land use will have an impact on any particular species or a particular type of wildlife. That can be positive as well as negative. And the key thing with development, I talked about, seeing fields, or seeing things that were once fields now development sites. We can build with nature in mind. And that's what we need to put at the forefront of all of this. So everything we do, and as Ian said about, nature-friendly farming, golf courses, every part of our day-to-day life, as long as we, build, create, recreate with nature in mind, then we will be able to make that difference.
And Ian, I think you mentioned that perhaps 40 years ago, we knew that there was a big problem. I mean, do you think we have been very negligent because maybe 40 years ago this wasn't so prominent, the urgency to do the sort of things that Karl was just talking about? So have we been negligent in that we've been slow to respond, do you think?
I think it's human nature to act when there's an emergency, and the emergency has only become apparent to most people in recent times when they've started to experience it themselves. Whether it be climate change, whether it be the decline in nature, when it's happening elsewhere or you're not obviously seeing it day to day, it can be difficult to comprehend exactly what's happening. And I think one of the challenges that we've faced in the UK is that the climate science has been spoken about so clearly and has had unanimous kind of agreement of the scientists that are looking at it, has not felt like it's impacting us now. And so much of the climate research has looked at what's going to happen, what's the world going to be like in 2050 or 2100, and what's nature going to look like then. And the reality is that the climate crisis is impacting us right here, right now in the UK, as it is around other parts of the world. There's farmers in Warwickshire this year who have not been able to grow crops on their fields because it's been too wet over the autumn and into the spring. So that's going to lead to reduced production of food in the UK this coming year for the first time in our lifetimes, really. And we're seeing extreme weather events happening more and more, and that's happening on our doorstep, impacting people, but it's also impacting wildlife. Some of our rarest species are on the brink, and they're on the brink because of a range of different factors. So something like a dormouse, we've got dormouse colonies in Warwickshire who are hanging on by a thread. We've reintroduced them into our woodlands to bolster the populations. And like a number of mammal species, they hibernate over the winter and rely on the need for a kind of a fairly comfortable, predictable weather pattern. So they look to go to hibernation at the end of the autumn into the winter, and ideally hibernate all the way through into the spring up until when they can reawake and emerge to find lots of berries and things to eat. If we have a winter like we've had in the last couple of years, where suddenly into February you get 20 degrees worth of heat from nowhere and the days start getting warmer, these animals wake up. Hedgehogs, dormice, other hibernating species wake up, but don't find any food because the rest of the plants and the food around in the environment where they live, which needs to grow for them to feed, has not had the chance to grow yet. So that then pushes them onto the brink of extinction, because without that food, that might be the final nail in the coffin that prevents that colony from surviving over the winter. So that's where climate change is so drastically impactful on the species that we hold so dear and that are so key to our surrounding areas. And then you've got other species like a barn owl. So barn owls don't have waterproof wings. It's an adaptation that they've evolved to have to make them silent in their flight, which helps them catch their prey, which is great if you're trying to catch prey when it's not raining. But at the moment, the weeks we've had recently where the weather has been so intense and we've had periods of rain for days on end, that prevents that barn owl from flying and catching any prey for multiple days at a time. And when barn owls are already facing pressures over habitat change and other things, that can be then another issue that they have to deal with. So this is how the climate and the nature emergency are interlinked. We can use nature to help us tackle the climate emergency, but the climate impacts are also happening on our rarest species.
And given that you've mentioned two species there, dormice and barn owls, and you've mentioned the impact that the weather is having on them, but we can't can we change the weather? We can maybe try and stop it getting worse, but
well, that's the real challenge. Is that obviously so much of this is out of our control. But what we can do is to create resilience in the landscape. So for species to be able to ride out the challenges that are created by climate change, what they need to have is that ability to move from one site to another if the area where they've got hasn't got any food. So you imagine a dormouse in a woodland that wakes up. Perhaps it might wake up in a woodland where there aren't enough food sources. But if it can get to the next woodland along the landscape by going down a hedgerow or walking through a woodland to another woodland, it's got more of a chance of finding food, finding a mate, and surviving through that period. Another challenge that wildlife has is that it's the way in which humans operate has led to this kind of these islands in effect, where the animals are isolated where they live and they can't get from one area to another. So through the work of the Wildlife Trust, what we're trying to do is to create these resilient habitats in the landscape, work at a landscape scale to create bigger, better, more joined up areas to allow the wildlife to move through, so that during these intense periods of increased weather that we're having through climate change, creatures have got, for all shapes and sizes, have got more of a chance of surviving and adapting to the conditions.
I actually saw a barn owl the other day in your patch, actually in South Warwickshire, and it certainly gave me a boost. So it's great to see all this wildlife and everything, and I know that is something that obviously you're trying to get back, and I think just generally it makes people feel better when they see creatures like this. You've talked just about corridors, or of making a corridor so animals can move around freely. Give us some examples of the sort of work that you're doing to allow that to happen, and presumably sometimes it's on private land, so how do you get on with persuading private landowners and farmers to do the work?
So our nature reserves that Karl can shed more light on in a minute are the kind of jewels in the crown of where the wildlife is in Warwickshire, the best examples of where there's a huge abundance of different wildlife. And what we do is we use those as the heart really of our landscape scale approach. So we identify farmers and landowners and people that are looking after land in that geography and try and work out how we can connect up things. Sometimes that's being by providing project support and actually doing work on farmland or private landowners, sometimes on council land, on golf courses. Essentially, however the land is managed, we're looking at a landscape scale to try and join up habitats by creating connectivity in the landscape, sometimes through things like hedgerows, but also through direct connectivity. But then some species are able to kind of almost use it as a stepping stone in the landscape. So for the more mobile species, some birds and larger mammals, you don't necessarily need one woodland to be right next to another. They can move across several fields to get between the two. And we're finding that with ponds, a lot of our pond work, we're trying to create this network of ponds that are scattered across the county, so that if you are a creature that's associated with ponds, amphibians and other species, they can move within a couple of fields to the next pond. And that's helping to create this resilience, particularly in response to climate change, but also in response to local issues. There might be a pond dries up in 1 year, or there might be a disease outbreak in that colony. So if you've got another habitat close by that the wildlife can move in from, you're able to create a greater sense of resilience within that population.
So Karl, you're in charge of the nature reserves. The sort of thing that Ian's talking about, have we seen that in action? I mean, have you noticed with the improvements you've made to the landscape that already species are beginning to thrive?
Yes, certainly. So, for us, with the habitat management that we undertake on our nature reserves, it's really, really important to help build in the resilience that Ian has suggested, to make sure that they're in the best condition they can possibly be for wildlife. On our nature reserves, we manage some of the most rarest and sort of fragile habitats in the county. But the other thing is to be, to sort of, they're really good as those arc sites, I suppose you could call them, where the wildlife can move out from. But also with the practical management that we have on site, we need to demonstrate that we can walk the walk and not just talk the talk. So as a wildlife trust, we can tell landowners to do this and do that, but we need to be able to demonstrate what it is that they can actually realise on their land through managing their woodlands or, increasing the wildflower diversity. And the great thing is that we can showcase those sites to landowners to bring them, to those sites and say, look, here we've got different breeding breeding species. Now, for some landowners, it's going to be tricky to recreate a Brandon marsh, say, which, we have over 250 different bird species come here at any point in the year. But actually, things like farmland birds, being able to get farmland birds back on farms is a win. And, we want to be able to translate the work that we do, show them that, on a particular site, we've got dormice, and if you're a neighbour and you've got a woodland site, then, well, they can move to your woodland too. But you need to do X, Y, and Z in terms of management and create age and structural diversity within the habitats. That's a real benefit, and it's something obviously that we work hard to do.
Do you find that most landowners are receptive to what you want to do, or do you get some hostility?
I think everybody has an opinion, and I think without giving a politician's answer, then yeah, of course there are some things that we do that some people might not necessarily agree with or see as perhaps the right thing for them on their land. So the really important thing is not to sort of, with a landowner in particular, is not necessarily try and challenge them on it too much, but is actually really sort of say, well, what do you and let's be honest, they know their land far better than we do. So, well, what is it that you want to do on your land for wildlife? Because if they've engaged with us, no doubt they've got a love of wildlife and they want to do more, but it's just about trying to find the right thing for them. So it might be that they don't want to create, lots and lots of new hedgerows or leave wide margins perhaps, but they might be interested in putting up a sparrow box, or they might be interested in putting up a barn owl box, which is, again, all of these things add up. And that's the way to really engage with landowners.
I mean, I guess the population of this country is increasing all the time at the moment, and there is that pressure to produce food. Does there come a point where, because of the pressure to produce food, that nature will, and all the things you want to do for nature will miss out?
There is a need for us to produce food. I think there's also a need for us to balance what we do and not, produce food at any cost by any particular means, because essentially if wildlife dies out, we die out too, and all that food's going to go to waste. So I think what we need to do is, again, and this is very much an area of Ian's work and background, but nature-friendly farming, it can be productive, it can provide food, and regenerative farming is a particularly new, not necessarily a new thing, but it's something that it might not produce the yields that farmers would see perhaps in a more intensive farming scheme, but what it actually does is it can potentially reduce costs. So it's all relative, isn't it? It's about showing that it works for your pocket, it works for wildlife, and it works for the environment. And that's something that, again, a number of the projects do, and farm advice and those kinds of things. So that's a really important thing to try to explain to landowners and farmers and get them on board with that, because we do need to produce food, but we also perhaps need to think about where food comes from more and what do we eat. So, but Ian's an expert on this. He might have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, from the Wildlife Trust's perspective, for us, it's not a choice between farming and nature. They should go hand in hand, and there are great case studies we've got locally of working with farmers where they're able to produce high quality food and support nature in a way that's helping bring wildlife back. And part of that is around changing the emphasis and the mindset of how we produce food and moving away from the idea of gross profit to net profit. So somebody far cleverer than me once described that, gross profit is if you imagine all the fish in the sea, and net profit are the fish in the net that you pull out. So essentially farmers can make lots of money, which is all the fish in the sea, but if it's cost them lots of money to grow the food in the first place, actually it's just the fish in the net that they get to take away and spend on their livelihood. So for a long time, farmers have been looking at the gross profit idea of how much is, say, we've made in a year, without actually taking into account their costs. And intensive farming has a lot of costs associated with it, whereas regenerative farming has fewer costs associated with it, and you're able to still take home quite a lot of money. So for farming, for any industry, for nature to be able to work alongside it, it needs to be economically viable. We need farmers to be able to produce high quality food and get paid to do so that they can support their families and live just as the rest of us do. And equally, for businesses to engage in nature, they need to be able to find a financial way of making it stack up for them. So this is about us reimagining a world where we place a greater value on wildlife and understand that there is a benefit to investing in nature. And for so long, we have seen as a society that nature is a cost. And it's deemed that if we invest in something that is going to add extra cost to what we do. But actually it's fundamental to everything that we need. You know, we rely on nature for clean air and for fresh water and for healthy food. and nature provides us with all that added value of health and well-being and other factors like that. And when you start to, it seems a bit weird to monetize nature, but when you start to put an economic value on the benefits of interacting with nature and the reduced costs that might place on the NHS and the ability then for the NHS to focus on other issues, you suddenly start seeing nature and the value of nature in a completely different way. So a lot of the work that Wildlife Trust is trying to do is to understand and see the world through other people's eyes, learn how farmers, the pressures that farmers are facing, and to try and get them to respond to that and adapt their business accordingly.
And you've talked about the great work that you're doing, but presumably you think both the government and people like us, the everyday layman, can do more as well for us to get a better future and restore nature.
Yeah, in really quick, simple terms, everybody can play their part in helping to address this. Small actions really do add up to make a big difference. And for so many species, individual actions at a local level can help be another piece of the jigsaw that helps nature recover. So whether you be somebody with a family at home or friends in a local community or in your business, everybody can make small changes and collectively they can add up to big picture differences.
And just briefly, if the work you're doing succeeds and the work that other wildlife organisations are doing, how do you see the countryside in 50 years' time?
It could look a lot different. It might not look an awful lot different in the sense that actually, you know, land is already farmed and managed and, you know, we need houses for people. So, you know, house building and, you know, the development of land is still going to be required. But what we'll be looking at in 50 years' time is an environment where nature comes first. And if we succeed, then, you know, us as a human race will succeed as well. So it means that we'll have healthier environments to live in, work in, we'll have healthier food to eat, and of course we'll start to see an abundance and a return of wildlife in Warwickshire and across the UK.
Excellent. Well, I said I like to be positive, and I think that's a positive note to end on. So Karl and Ian, thanks very much for that chat and for being so informative.
Cheers.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust's podcast with me, Bob Hockenhull. If you'd like to find out more about the Trust, visit our website at warwickshirewildlifetrust.org.uk.